Good evening. My name is Jacinta Thompson and I'm the Executive Director and Exhibitions and Events Producer for the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Hawke Centre and the University of South Australia. In doing so, I take this opportunity to acknowledge that the University of South Australia is on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. We recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and we acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. Our event tonight, Democracy in Peril, will feature Professor Monica Attard, Co-Director, Centre for Media Transition, University of Technology, Sydney, Dr. Emma Shortis, Senior Researcher, International and Security Affairs Program, the Australia Institute. Associate Professor Priya Chacko, International Politics from the University of Adelaide. And they will be in conversation with Misha, Ketchell, Editor and Executive Director of The Conversation, Australia and New Zealand. So a very warm welcome to the four of you. Thank you so much for joining us at the Hawke Centre. And Misha, great to have you back as always. We are thrilled to be co-presenting this event with The Conversation, and I would like to thank Misha and his team for bringing together tonight's extraordinary panel and for such a timely conversation with global elections, as we know, unfolding around us. The session tonight is being recorded and will be available on the Hawke Centre website next week. I encourage you to bring this to the attention of your friends and colleagues who could not be here tonight. I also must say hello to our live streaming friends. There are 800 plus online audience tonight. Hi everyone. I said to the panellists, don't be scared, it's fine. They're not in the room, so that's a good thing. So it's wonderful to actually reach out to many interstate and international people too. Now, as we are filming, can I please ask that you switch your phones to silent to avoid interruptions? And it is now my pleasure to welcome Misha and the panellists, and Misha is going to take over proceedings and introduce the panellists to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jacinta, and thank you everybody for coming tonight. What we're going to be discussing is the performance and the state that democracy is in currently all over the world. And we have three terrific panellists with us tonight who are all people who have got expertise in specific democracies. So I'm just going to introduce them really quickly. I'm going to make a few opening remarks just to set the scene about the questions we're going to look at, and then we're going to immediately start talking to the panellists. So Monica Attard is a decorated journalist, journalism professor from the University of Technology in Sydney, an expert on Russia and a terrific reporter on Russia and writer on Russia. And she's also my old boss. Very early in my career in journalism, I was working as a researcher on Media Watch, running around trying to get stories for Monica. So it's terrific to have Monica here today. We also have Priya Chacko, who is a historian and writer with the University of Adelaide, a senior researcher who has got a focus on foreign policy in India and the Indo-Pacific region. And Emma Shortis, who is, you still have a role at RMIT University, as well as working at the Australia Institute as a researcher. And Emma has written quite significantly about the US and about living in the US. Just to set the stage, I want to go back to something that the historian Francis Fukuyama wrote in 1992, when he said basically that we'd reached the end of history, and that from this moment on, what we were going to see was history was no longer going to be a process of evolution. We were just going to see Western liberal democracy spread all over the world. I think you can probably say that the ensuing 30 years have been a process of proving him wrong. and that we have seen the emergence of a number of serious threats to democracy. We've seen changes in the media landscape. We've seen the rise of populism and authoritarianism. And what we're going to do is talk about this very particular year for elections, 2024. I think almost half the globe is going to be voting in elections this year, and just look at how democratic those electoral processes are, and then we're going to move into talking a little bit about what that might mean for the state of democracy globally, but also in Australia. It's something that we're going to consider as well. So perhaps I'll start. So we've got the three elections. One that's just happened, which is the Russian election, which happened in March. We've got the election in India, which is still occurring. And obviously we're looking forward to an election in the US in November this year. Looking forward is maybe the wrong choice of words there, Emma? Possibly, okay. We'll start with Monica, because you paid close attention to the election in Russia. Can you just tell us what happened and give us your perspective on how sort of fair and free that electoral process was?
Thanks, Misha, and always lovely to share a room with you and a stage with you. So there was an election in Russia in March. It occurred some 2 weeks after the rather shocking and unexpected death of Alexei Navalny in a prison in the Arctic Circle, which had a little bit of an impact on the way the 2 weeks leading up to the election panned out, but not a huge impact, in fact, no impact on the result. That was largely because the result was entirely manufactured. So there was an election. It delivered Putin an 87% vote, which is quite extraordinary. Which tells you a number of things. One, it wasn't free and fair. Two, it tells you that there were no viable candidates other than Putin who were permitted to run. So his two main opponents were the leader of the Communist Party, who runs in every presidential election, Gennady Zyuganov, who got a very, very small proportion of the vote, and the leader of a brand new party, which is called the New People's Party, which has basically been constructed to absorb some of the disaffection that young people are feeling in Russia at the moment. And so it would say that it was anti-war, but in fact, when you look at its policy, what it is it's not really anti-war at all. It believes that Ukraine should entirely capitulate to Russia, hand over its territory, throw up the white flag and walk away. So not really anti-war. So they got a very, very small proportion of the vote as well. And this is against a background of a country that has no free media. So independent media began to flourish when the Soviet Union collapsed back in 1991. Actually, it was flourishing a few years before the Soviet Union collapsed, but then it really, really took off. A lot of new publications. They were doing exactly the sort of thing that you would want a thriving, healthy media to be doing in a liberal democracy, even though that was a big stretch to call what Russia was in the intervening years a liberal democracy, but still it was more democratic than it currently is. And then about 10 years ago, when paranoia really set in with Putin, the media began to contract, to put it nicely. In other words, it was being forced to close down piece by piece. There were some parts of it that remained healthily funded, sometimes by Western interests, which really upset the Kremlin. And they survived for a while until February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded its neighbour, Ukraine. From that point onwards, a new law was introduced that you couldn't call the war a war. It had to be a special military operation. You couldn't criticise the war. You couldn't criticise the military. Criticising what government is doing is part and parcel of what a free and independent media does. That together with a law that had been brought into play in Russia, I think 5 or 6 years earlier, which allowed the Kremlin to declare any agency or any group to be a foreign agency, in other words, an enemy, that label was applied to a lot of media, and so when the war happened, a lot of media, independent Russian media, had to leave. So no independent media. Lots of independent Russian media outside of Russia, none of which can be legally broadcast inside the country. Although people still have access to it because, despite what people say, Russians still have VPN. So they might not have a free media, but they can access free media if they choose to. But by and large, what most people are exposed to is Kremlin propaganda. So you don't have a free election, really. And on top of that, you have a very, very, very healthy habit by the Kremlin, by the Kremlin's technologists, as we like to call them, of massaging the vote. So, for example, just to give you an idea, in the previous 4 elections, the first election that Putin actually stood in, he did quite well in that one. Then his vote went down to 67%, and in the third one it was 74%. In the fourth one it was 77%, and now it's shot up to 87%. So either the technologists are getting very lazy, which is what I think is happening, or best case scenario, Russia is a vast country of 5 time zones and 87 autonomous and semi-autonomous regions. Some of those regions in the east, which were the first to vote, got very enthusiastic about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and voted for him, and the technologists didn't adjust the figures to bring that 87% down to something that is a slightly more believable, maybe 79, and 2% up on 77. So there were lots of things at play, but I think where we end up is that we can't call this a free and fair election. It wasn't.
So a chicken and egg question, because we have, an authoritarian leader firmly in charge. Do you think it was an authoritarian leader dismantling state media, or do you think that the media actually played a role in the rise of Putin consolidating his hold on power?
No, I don't think the media played a role in that at all, actually. I mean, I think that there were parts of the what was the independent sector of the Russian media that were very oppositionist. I mean, they were good investigators. They didn't shy away from issues. They made sure that they were constantly holding the Kremlin to account. And I think that for a long time he was very, very, very tolerant of that, incredibly tolerant. In fact, I used to be astounded not only at his tolerance of some sectors of the media who were highly critical of him, but the level of criticism that he was receiving in the electorate, amongst people, was quite big. I mean, there were shops that were set up selling stuff that sent Putin up. Yeah, I mean those and tourist stalls outside the Kremlin where you buy wobbly dolls with Putin's head on it. I mean, none of this was an indicator of an authoritarian leader that was going to brook no criticism.
Yeah.
For a long time he did.
So there's a political scientist called John Keane who's an expert in democracy, and he's talking about Duterte and his sort of form of authoritarian leadership, and described it as a form of gaslighting. Like said that basically authoritarian leaders, one of the aspects of the playbook now is sort of saying a lot of things that are misinformation or disinformation that aren't literally true, that actually can create a cult of charisma, but also a confusion in the electorate. Do you think that is Putin's approach now? Is he spreading misinformation with Russian voters? And has that always been the case, if that is something that he's doing?
I mean, I think to say that he's spreading misinformation it seems to indicate that he knows that it's wrong. I don't think he does know that. I think he really believes it. I think, and I think that it's very hard to call it misinformation when it is the entire narrative, that there is nothing else. There's nothing to compare it to. So, personally, I think that the line that the Kremlin has given its people, which is variously, only with us can you live a good life, but in order to have that good life, you have to give up certain rights. One of those rights is, you keep your political opinions to yourself. 2, you let us do what we need to do with the business community so that we can make sure that everything's tickety-boo. We get our cut, they get their cut. Corruption is not something that we talk about an awful lot. 3, that you're happy to have no free media. because they're troublesome anyway. And so that's the social compact. And if people, so he's convinced people that if they accept that social compact, he can keep them living in wealth and safe. Now, he's failed on the first one, and he could fail on the second as well. So people are very disillusioned that they're not living as well as they have in the past. So he's kind of fractured the electorate. So he's got young people who think that he's out of tune, out of line, he's a warmonger and a fascist and an autocrat and all the rest of it, all those terms that he probably isn't, because he's not a fascist, he's not an autocrat. And the old people who think, well, we're not living as well as we used to, so what's going on here? This social compact isn't really working very much to us. So he has to overlay that with a narrative, a new narrative. And the new narrative is there's this big, ugly West out there that wants to knock us off, led by the United States. And I have to personally protect you against this. So, trust me, and I will do that. That's the new narrative, and people have believed it.
Okay. Might come back to that. We'll just go to Priya next. So we're in the middle of an election in India. When I say in the middle, it's a 6-week election, is that right? Can you maybe just give us an update on where we're up to with Modi's re-election?
Yeah, we are in the middle. We're in the third phase.
Yep.
So about 10 states are going to the polls all over the country, but the big ones that are going to the polls are Gujarat, a bit of Uttar Pradesh, a bit of Karnataka, a bit of Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra. So very big popular states are going to the polls now. So it's a crucial phase in the Indian election.
And how's the election going? Do you think again, is it a free and fair election?
It's been an extraordinary election. I've never seen anything like it, actually. I don't think it meets the standard for a free and fair election. But there's been scandal after scandal after scandal. So, major opposition leaders have been arrested. They're sitting in jail. There's been a major corruption scandal to do with election financing, which has benefited the ruling party. The opposition Congress Party can't access all of its funds. There's been a freeze on that. The government's been using the various agencies, like the Enforcement Directorate, the tax agencies, to harass media, to harass its opposition. And we've got now Modi, who's been very careful in the last 10 years to sort of project himself as this global statesman, as this guru, representative of God, who is virtuous and non-corrupt and pure. He's now spewing anti-Muslim hate speech on the campaign trail, and he's spreading disinformation about, or politicking, depending on your outlook, about the Congress Party, the opposition's election manifesto. And he's doing this constantly in North India, which is the heartland of his party.
Is the media keeping him honest on that, or is...
The mainstream media is not keeping him honest because it's very pro-government. It's striking, actually. He did an event before the election had started with a major media house called India Today. This is a magazine that my parents subscribed to. I used to read it all the time. I had a lot of respect for it. But it's become what's called in India the Gaudy media, which is lapdog media. So the proprietor of that outfit was actually got on the podium and said, it's not our job to be the opposition. Well, no, it's not the job of the media to be the opposition, but it is the job to report fairly, not share a platform with the Prime Minister and praise him. So the mainstream media, unfortunately, is extremely pro-government, is celebratory, is not covering these major scandals. The latest one is a horrific sex abuse scandal involving an ally of the Prime Minister. And the mainstream media has barely touched it. There is an independent media, but it's under pressure from tax raids, defamation lawsuits, and that independent media has found a platform on social media. YouTube is blossoming now with various sorts of fact-checking shows, influencers trying to hold the government to account. But social media is still a minor player in India's media landscape. Most people still get their information from television and newspapers. So unfortunately, the media is not free and fair, and that's affecting how free and fair this election is going to be.
So you wrote an article about the Indian election for The Conversation recently, and I think you said that there had been a decline in the health of democracy in India. What do you think is driving that? Is that all Modi at sort of his influence, or are there other forces at play?
I think it has a lot to do with Modi. There was a bit of decline in democracy with the previous government. If you look at sort of VDEM indicators and data, there was a decline from that point. And I think, in my view, that was because the government was finding it so difficult to get things through Parliament and trying to do what it wanted to do. It resorted to certain authoritarian practices, which wasn't good. However, it's just deeply increased in terms of authoritarianism under the Modi government, and I think it's related to his philosophy, his governing philosophy, and his organicist nationalist ideology. It's very similar to Putin, actually, the things that you were saying. He tries to cultivate this air of trust. Only I can make India great. The West is impeding India's rise, so when the West criticises Indian democracy, he says, this is a conspiracy, they're trying to prevent our rise, and he says that about journalists, about the Liberal opposition in India.
So you were saying that the media is not holding him to account. Like, why is that? Has the media been willingly conscripted to the Modi cause? Like, why is there a direct power being exerted on them?
I think it has to do with economics as well. The media is reliant on the government for advertising revenue, for instance, so that's a tool that the government can wield over the media. But they seem to have decided that this is the only way to ensure survival at the moment in India, is to be pro-government and to flourish in India. So they've hopped on that bandwagon, unfortunately.
So you sort of reach this autocratic state which has perhaps some stability. Can you see anything that could break it up?
I'm not sure that it is stable, actually, because the thing is, India is a very big country. It has a very argumentative history. It has governments that are not ruled by the BJP, Modi's party, who are now being starved of funds, so they need to be given funding so that they can pay people pensions and things like that. So they're getting extremely unhappy at the moment. These are, rich, powerful states. So that's the level, that's the degree of instability. There are protests against the laws that, the government has tried to introduce, and they've tried to oppress those protests, but if things happen in the future, there will be protests, there will be resistance. There'll be resistance from state governments as well, because India is a federal structure. Modi will try to tamper with that, but there will always be resistance in India. It's too big a country to be ruled by an autocrat in that way.
Okay, so we're getting poor marks for democracy in Russia, poor marks in India. Emma, come on. You've got something for us.
No, I don't, sorry. It's, yeah, look, I mean, I think the United States has always been an imperfect democracy, and I think we can't really even describe it as a democracy until the mid-1960s and the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And of course, the 1960s, I think, is very present in people's minds today as we watch student protests unfolding across the United States. So I am very worried. I think we should all be really worried about the state of American democracy. And that's for, I mean, there are two reasons really that really stand out for me as to why we should be worried. We can talk about polling if you like. It is pretty extraordinary that as I last checked, Trump is polling in aggregate national polls ahead of Biden by somewhere between 1 and 2 percentage points, which is in itself pretty extraordinary. But the main thing that worries me about that is, of course, that Trump, as we know, is an active and present threat to American democracy. He's been very open about the fact that he is committed to both enacting revenge and retribution against the people he thinks have wronged him, but also actively dismantling the institutions of American democracy. And he and his supporters, his surrogates, and I think it's really important to say that it's not just Trump, even if Trump goes away tomorrow, I don't think any of this is over. And that's because he, and particularly the movement behind him, have learned the lessons of the first Trump administration. If there is a second Trump administration, it will be radically different from the first because it has learned from its mistakes. The movement has learned from its mistakes where, in the first Trump administration, we had the so-called adults in the room who were curbing Trump's worst instincts. I sort of have quite a bit of a problem with that framing, but, nevertheless, they have plans, detailed, granular plans for making sure that they won't be thwarted by what they call the administrative state. So there's plans, for example, to reenact something called Schedule F, which is a Trump-era executive order that would allow the president to reclassify tens of thousands of independent civil servants, so independent federal employees, to reclassify them as political appointees, summarily fire them, and then install tens of thousands of Trump loyalists into the federal bureaucracy. And they've actually got a bank already, through a project run by the Heritage Foundation, of those potential employees. So they've set up a kind of what you might call like a conservative LinkedIn, where Trump loyalists can sign up and answer some questions, pass a few tests that aren't around their expertise in governance or any area, they're around their loyalty to Trump. So there are those plans, and there's so much more in it around, dismantling the protections around the Department of Justice, for example, so Trump can pursue his enemies, in the courts.
So just interrupt there just quickly. There was a theory around the first Trump presidency that Trump was actually too incompetent to be effective in terms of the Washington processes. Are you saying that your view is that he has learnt or could learn from that period of time and be more effective if he were to be re-elected?
I think Trump is still Trump. Certainly his volatility, his tendency to lash out, and his, pretty proud lack of understanding of how the institutions of American democracy function still exists. But what has happened in the intervening period since he was president is that the movement has united behind him in a way that it just didn't in the 4 years of his presidency, and is working out a way to both kind of unite themselves, so unite the kind of loose coalition of, from libertarians to arch conservatives that support Trump, and are attempting at least, I think, to harness his power for those really far-right ideological ends. And I think you can see how effective that has been through this project. It's called Project 2025, run by the Heritage Foundation, which now has a coalition of 100 plus conservative organisations kind of on the bandwagon and working for a second Trump administration. So all of that taken together, Trump still being Trump, I think, but all of that taken together means that a second Trump administration would be a lot more dangerous for American democracy than the first one.
Okay. Now I'm just going to jump in there and mention that Emma's written a terrific article for the conversation on this Project 2025 Heritage Foundation document. If you want some sort of scary nighttime reading, it's really worth a look. It's a terrific read. So my next question for you is, as we're sort of coming into the election cycle, and we're looking at Trump's prospects of winning, and we're looking at what's going to happen in the election itself. I mean, the role of the American media is going to be so important. There's been a lot written and said about American media failures, particularly after the previous election and the January 6th protests. How do you think the American media is faring, and what do you think the prospects are of sort of having a robust reality-based debate?
Look, I think the reality is that the American mainstream media still don't know how to deal with Trump. They don't know how to address his constant lying and the extraordinary fact that he's the first president ever to face criminal charges and to be sitting in court. He's in court this week, he's in court for the next couple of weeks, and there was a moment in the first couple of days of, actually it was the first day of his trial, where he nodded off during the trial. But there was this kind of conversation going on amongst journalists who were covering the trial about whether they should say that, because he was exhibiting the physical signs of nodding off, but they couldn't be sure because they couldn't see his face. And so there was all this kind of dancing around, like, how do we cover Trump and how do we kind of remain impartial and cover this candidate? And what kind of ends up happening is that, against even their best instincts, often still treat Trump like he's a normal candidate. and go to kind of extraordinary efforts as well to try and find coherence in what he's doing. And so I highly recommend reading, there's an article in Time magazine based on several hours of interviews with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. And so there's quite an extraordinary article about Trump's plans for the presidency, what he will do, listing off all of these extraordinary things about how, he's not sure if he's going to go after Biden with a criminal trial, if he does return to the presidency, all of the things he'll undo. But then you can also read the transcripts. So they publish the transcripts of those interviews as well. And you can see that the extraordinary amount of effort that has to go into making Trump coherent. And so the picture I think that American voters get of him still doesn't reflect, just how unhinged this guy is. And so mainstream media is still struggling. And you add to that, of course, to a totally fractured media landscape where you have outlets like Fox News in pursuit of an increasingly conservative, extremist audience, peddling conspiracy theories, peddling quite openly white supremacist great replacement theories on, mainstream television watched by millions of people. That you then have this kind of extraordinary situation where the media feels, the mainstream media, I think, is torn and kind of in agony over how to deal with him, being begged by the current president to cover the stakes of this election. Just a couple of weeks ago, Biden was at the White House press correspondents' dinner asking the media not to take sides, but to report the stakes of this election. And I'm just not sure that they'll be able to get it right.
Do you think traditional media methods can even work? I mean, I'm thinking about, there was a book that's been much quoted sort of since the Trump presidency called On Bullshit by a philosopher called Harry Frankfurt, I think it's Harry Frankfurt, who was writing about the difference between something which is like a factual inaccuracy, a clear lie, and something that is a stream of consciousness that is meant to create a sense of a vibe or a sense of orientations or feelings. And basically the argument that's been made is that Trump's dialogue, when Trump speaks, it's not really about specific factual claims. So fact-checking him doesn't make sense. It's about communicating to a base, a vibe, a sense of sentiments itself. So I guess my question about that is, if that is true, and then literalism and fact-checking doesn't work, how do you engage with a leader like that?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think that, the point about the vibe is so important because Trump is so effective at employing that kind of narrative where it's a stream of consciousness, and of course there are brazen lies in it all the time, but there is also this sense that he taps into amongst many of his supporters of being victimised, of being under attack, and of I suppose, well, he says much in the way that Putin and Modi do, that I am the only thing standing between you and them. I am the only thing that's going to save you, and so reporting that and kind of the history of that, I think, becomes incredibly difficult. And I think what really gets lost in a lot of the media coverage, especially as it's focused on fact-checking, on specific instances, on specific things that Trump has said, alongside a kind of fixation on the polling, of course, and the horse race of the American election. What I think... excuse me, I think what happens then is you lose the long threads of history that have allowed Trump to rise to power. And so you lose a sense of the kind of deep-seated white supremacy in much of American history that allows Trump to employ a victimisation narrative so effectively. You lose a sense of the deep despair amongst Americans around their economic futures, around their health futures, around the kind of violence that they face, and that particularly that their children face. You lose that sense of despair, I think, amongst so many Americans that allows Trump to tap into those narratives. And that deep history of American politics that has facilitated the rise of Trump gets lost. And so then what happens is we don't understand him or how he can be so effective, and we fall into this trap of fact-checking him or agonising over whether he fell asleep and not what he actually means.
So just to hold your feet to the fire for a minute, do you think he's going to win?
Oh gosh, I think he could. I think he absolutely could win. we talked about, democracies and the United States being an imperfect democracy. The nature of the American system means that, the national popular vote is irrelevant. What matters is the electoral college, and what matters is a system that's been gerrymandered to within an inch of its existence. And so, the election will come down to, like, probably a couple of swing states, like I mentioned, Pennsylvania, potentially Michigan, could come down to a couple of thousand votes in a couple of states. And then, you take the kind of next logical step and say, well, if those couple of thousand votes mean that Trump loses, we know he's not going to accept that result because he's told us. And we have had a preview of what his supporters will do. And so there are very few, even if he doesn't win outright, I think there are very few good outcomes.
Okay.
Sorry.
So there's not a lot of good news there. So maybe just let's step back for a minute and turn to Australia. Sitting here, it feels, listening to the three of you, like we have some cause for complacency in Australia. The ANU released a report on democracy last year that said that 70% of people were satisfied or very satisfied with Australian democracy. We've got the Australian Electoral Commission, we've got compulsory voting. Do you think that we should feel that we're doing comparatively quite well? Maybe I'll start with Monica. How do you think our democracy is going?
Look, compared to these three countries that we've been talking about, I think we are a relatively healthy democracy. We've got our problems, of course, and we've seen breakthroughs of very, very worrying tendencies of, the kind of crazy demagogic types of political rhetoric that can often that can break out and often assume the mainstream, which is even more worrying. But that always gets called out, so that's a good thing. I think overall, whilst we have our problems with misinformation, dare I say disinformation, we face the same kind of the global economic winds of change and pain that the rest of the world do, that because we're a relatively small country and a federation which provides some checks and balances within an overall system, that we're by and large an educated population, that we're a very, very successful multicultural society with its problems, but overall, generally speaking, a relatively successful one, that we're okay. It's not too bad. I'm not pessimistic about Australia.
Okay. Priya, do you share that optimism?
I do, because the basics, the fundamentals are there. However, the rapid decline of democracy in India tells us that we shouldn't be complacent about anything. All it takes is for a few people to change who have authoritarian views to completely change the landscape, and that can happen very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and that was an American mindset for such a long time, wasn't it? That it can't happen here, and so complacency, I think, is really dangerous. I think we have lots of reasons to be confident, though. Misha, you mentioned the Australian Electoral Commission, which is envied a lot, I think, in many places, including the United States, and we have compulsory voting, and I think that is so critical to the health of our democracy. The United States would be unrecognisable if they had compulsory voting. The policy landscape would be completely different. You would have gun control, you would have reproductive rights, you would have a functioning, or hopefully you would have much more functional Congress. And so I think that guarding compulsory voting in particular is such a critical thing. But there are always things we could do to improve. Our transparency is a bit of a problem.
So speaking of improvements, we were having a discussion in the green room before, and maybe a little bit of an argument around the fact that the government has currently got proposals for truth in political advertising laws. I'd be very interested to hear all your views on whether that is potentially an improvement that could add to the strength of our democracy, or whether you see risks in it. Does anybody want to jump in on that one?
Oh, you're looking at me. Okay. So look, I think that I didn't even realise that South Australia had truth in political discourse laws, and so I can't claim to know an awful lot about it. But it would seem to me that as a matter of overall principle that it's always very difficult when you are asking a government to regulate the way people communicate. You know, regulation in this space is really, really fraught. And we're seeing that play out, for example, with the current law that the Labor government, federal government, is trying to get through to force the digital platforms, the Metas, Facebook and X and all the rest of them, to be more open about what they're doing about mis and disinformation on their platforms, right? So, you know, you can see the dangers. I mean, do we want to have government telling anybody what they can and can't say, or even though they're not in this case, but having any say at all about what can be said in the public sphere? And I mean, I think that the laws to regulate the way politicians and political parties communicate kind of is in that space as well. So, you know, if it works well, great, and if there are protections in place, great. But I think at the end of the day, you can't get past the fact that people are uncomfortable with governments meddling in that space. In terms of mis and disinformation, the platforms are really uncomfortable with regulating in that space as well, not having government regulate them, regulating themselves. And we're all uncomfortable with the notion that nothing's being done. So we're kind of in a real bind. And I think with political advertising, it's a bit the same. People want political parties to be able to say what they really think without fear or favour, but they don't want them to lie. So you're trying to get into that sweet spot where you're saying you can say what you want, you can have policies, you can have platforms, but you just can't lie.
Yeah. It's interesting actually, because there was obviously discussion about this recently when Elon Musk made the argument that it wasn't, you know, the Australian government shouldn't be telling X to take down the video of that attack on the religious leader in Sydney on free speech grounds. Do you think that's right? I mean, there's an interesting piece in Crikey by Bernard Keane where he argued that actually Musk had a point there.
I think he's got a total point. Yeah. I think Bernard Keane was right in that piece. And I think that it's a very, very big call to say to you know, to X, which is a public space, you know, you can't. This is what you can't say this. I mean, when it's not hate speech, when it's not when it's not terrorist speech, when it's not inciting insurrection, whatever.
Does anybody disagree with that?
I mean, I think we do. You know, we do regulate speech. We regulate hate speech,
but,
just as you say.
Limits, but there's limitations around that.
Yeah, of course. But I think also we have to be careful to not conflate what are two related but different issues. You know, the question of truth in political advertising is slightly different to the regulation of social media and violent content, particularly on social media, because that wasn't misinformation. That's horrendous content. And so I think, you know, as we said, South Australia's had truth in political advertising laws for some time now, and they've worked quite effectively. And we've done polling at the Australia Institute that suggests an overwhelming majority of Australians want truth in political advertising laws. So people are deeply concerned about that. But
yeah, they don't like politicians. They don't want them to lie.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
in the abstract, isn't it? I mean, you can easily say in the abstract, yes, we want. I mean, it's like saying, do you like panda bears or something? I mean, of course you're going to say, yes, you want truth. But when the rubber hits the road, when somebody is saying to you, your political ad, we are not going to allow that to appear because we think it's not truthful. I mean, I think about a couple of elections ago, Clive Palmer had this really annoying ad where he said interest rates would be 2 to 3% or something under him. And I was like, well, you can't say that with any accuracy. You can't know. But equally, we can't disprove it. I mean, they might be 2 to 3%. I mean, it's a prediction about the future. I mean, could you have somebody saying, no, that's not true, and you've got to take down that ad?
I mean, I think you have to be really careful about the nature of those potential regulations, but the fact that it's difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. And I also think what sometimes gets missed in that discussion of regulating misinformation and disinformation, and coming particularly from an American perspective, is that we don't often address why misinformation and disinformation is so effective. Like, you know, why is it so much more effective in the United States, for example, than it is here? Why is conspiracy theory such an enormous problem for the United States in a way that it just isn't here. That's not to suggest it's not a problem here, but it's not at the scale of the United States. And that's because the United States is a broken place, with politics that isn't effective, where people are struggling with inequality and with a society that doesn't value them and doesn't keep them safe. And so you combine that with a particular form of American exceptionalism and misinformation thrives. And so you can try and regulate that, but without addressing the underlying issues at play, the structural issues of poverty, of racism, of poor health, then all of those misinformation will still be incredibly effective because you're not addressing the structural issues.
Okay. Priya, would you be comfortable with truth in advertising, political advertising laws?
I tend toward free speech absolutism. I'm not even sure that I agree completely with hate speech laws unless it's related to inciting violence. And I also don't know, and Emma might have data on this, but I'm not sure that we have all that much evidence in terms of the impact of disinformation and misinformation on voters. As far as I can tell, there isn't actually strong evidence to suggest that that has a huge impact on how people vote, because people are already mistrustful of politicians. They already think they lie. They don't trust the media very much either. So I think that voters aren't completely stupid. So there's something else going on here, I think, with Trump. I don't think it's all the fault of misinformation and disinformation.
Emma, do you have the evidence for it?
No, I think that is a really good point, and I guess that's what I was trying to get at, in that, it's not, misinformation is not the reason that Americans are voting for Trump. I think it kind of plays a role, and there's a tendency amongst some Democrats at least, and I'll be interested in what Monica thinks, to suggest that Russian misinformation in particular is responsible, or disinformation is responsible for Trump's rise. But again, I would go back and say, well, why is that misinformation so effective? Why are people drawn to Trump when many American voters, they know he lies? They will do vox pops out the front of Trump rallies and say, yeah, I know he lies, but I'm voting him for this reason, or I'm voting for him for this reason. So I think you're totally right, Priya, that, that doesn't, it plays a role, but it doesn't explain what's going on.
So just to ask another regulation question, if you think, I was reading the Brian Stelter book about, called Network of Lies, about the role of Fox News in spreading misinformation about the US election. And the reason that Fox News spread that misinformation was because they knew their audience would go elsewhere. They'd go to Newsmax or something called ONA. So you can see media businesses that have got a model playing to certain sectors of the community, and you're talking about the fact that you're saying some of the issues that we're talking about in American democracy have got to do with the very real lived experiences of people's lives, and that's why certain media are appealing to certain people. But would you be comfortable with regulation that stepped in and held media outlets accountable for spreading things that they know to be untrue? I mean, because to me that was just extraordinarily shocking, that a professional mainstream media outlet would have something that they knew to be factually untrue. It was known throughout the entirety of the newsroom, and yet it was being spread anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it is extraordinary to read about, Fox News covering the January 6th insurrection and realising their voters were their viewers were disappearing, and so pivoting, and you can see them, continuing to double down on that, on those conspiracy theories. I mean, I think I'm as uncomfortable with regulating that kind of speech as everyone here. I guess I would suggest that, particularly in the case of the United States, if we go back to that comparison, perhaps the way to restore trust in media, perhaps the way to kind of restore that kind of coverage, and particularly truth-telling in that kind of coverage, is to properly fund public broadcasters and to have a robust media ecosystem that is supported properly and isn't forced into those kind of commercial decisions that force outlets, to pander to a particular kind of audience. And so again, in Australia we have a public broadcaster that's not funded as well as it could be, but that makes a difference. You see in polling consistently that viewers trust the public broadcaster much more than they trust other outlets. And so I think, again, to go back to those kind of structural questions, I think the way that we address those problems is not by kind of retrospectively imposing regulation over the top, which often is just kind of tinker around the edges with the problem, but by actually really funding a robust media ecosystem that can survive the kind of shocks that we've talked about.
So Monica, you worked for the ABC for many, many years. Do you agree that part of the solution is better funding for public broadcasting?
Well, yes. I mean, it would be great for the ABC to have more money, and it is consistently the most trusted, media organisation in the country. I think the question really is, do I think that the solution to the problem that we have in the information ecosystem can all be resolved by government money? And I suspect not. I think it's a lot bigger than that. And I think a lot of the problem is the platforms, the social media platforms, and the unregulated way in which they behave, and the fact that they have become, they're sovereign states. They're borderless sovereign states. No law applies to them. Nobody has any. They refuse to tell us what they're doing to regulate themselves. X isn't even in Digi anymore. They can opt in and out of regulation as they want. So, I mean, I think it's that to me that is part of the problem. I mean, I think we have to accept that media has changed. That we no longer look at media is no longer a series of media organisations that make up the information ecosystem. It's much more diffuse, and the way it's distributed digitally is via, by and large, social media platforms, let's face it, a lot of the time. And that's where we're losing not only money but trust. And so I think the problem is, so multifaceted that I'm not sure that throwing money at public broadcasting or public media alone is the answer.
Okay, so one of the other solutions that's been proposed by the people who run the platforms that have created this problem, by the likes of Google and Facebook, has been that what we need to do is teach young people how to identify misinformation and disinformation. They put this under the category of digital literacy, which basically is a way of saying we've created this system of information which is infected, where it's impossible to tell what's true and what's not, and the only solution is teach the young people to work it out for themselves.
Yeah.
So Priya, you're in the university sector, you're working with young people every day. Do you think you can teach them to basically have a DIY approach to misinformation?
I think they are quite critical of the media, and yes, I think it can be taught, not just at university, at primary school level. I have friends who have high school age, primary school age children and she talks to them all the time about identifying misinformation, disinformation, and they're very good at it now. They're very sceptical. So yes, I think that actually there is some responsibility that we all need to take in this context, and the media as well. I mean, I know that it's fragmented. Professional bodies aren't really enforcing professional standards anymore, but is there some sort of role for a professional media organisation to hold each other accountable for these sorts of things?
Monica?
Well, that's a great question there, Priya. It's one of our bugbears. So the issue is standards and how they're policed, how they're created and policed. It's a really, really big one. So you have media organisations that have their own editorial codes and their own ethical codes, which they constantly breach because you can push them around so much. And then you have these external bodies. At the Centre for Media Transition, we have recognised, we have counted up more than, I think, 12 different standards bodies, the Australian Press Council, the ACMA, Free TV. I mean, there's a dozen of them. And all of their codes and their standards are slightly different to each other. And they all come from an era when media was siloed. So you had print, and then you had TV, and then you had radio. Well, we don't have that anymore. We've just got this big blob called the media. And, radio stations who do printed versions of their stories online. The ABC does print, video, audio, everything. It does everything. So those silos have broken down, but the standards bodies haven't caught up. And so we've often talked about the need for there to be reform. And we've actually been doing, and if you go to our website, you'll see some of the latest research that we've done where we're looking at the way other countries, other jurisdictions handle this issue. and the way the kinds of bodies that they have overlooking what the media is doing to make sure that the media are all doing the right thing. And, you know, I think we can safely say that in Australia, after what we've seen in recent weeks, particularly out of the Learmonth trial, no, they're not. They're not all doing the right thing. And that's because they all have different standards. So would Channel 7 have been able to do what it did in relation to Bruce Learmonth, or would the project have been able to broadcast what it broadcast in relation to Bruce Learmonth, if they were, you know, all members of the MEAA, the Union for Journalists, which has a code of ethics, which you're not obliged to follow, but you're kind of morally obliged to follow. The code of ethics wouldn't have permitted them to do any of that. Right? Yeah. But they weren't members of the union, and so there was no obligation to follow that code of ethics. And the code of ethics that did apply to them did permit them to do what they did, because it only applies to news, not to current affairs. So they're all different standards. You know, there's all these gaps that you can drive a truck through. So we need reform at the of the way standards are created, the way they're imposed, the way they're policed, and what the sanctions are. You know, the APC, the Australian Press Council, can pull up a newspaper for some egregious error, and the only sanction is that they have to publish a finding from the APC. Well, you can publish that finding on the back page on the sport page if you want.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, actually. Peter Grest has been going around talking up this idea of like a Media Freedom Act. And as part of that, he's been proposing that there be a set of agreed standards that journalists have to sign up to or agree to comply with to sort of receive the benefits of legislation that might provide some freedoms or rights for journalists in their reporting work, some sort of protections. Has he talked to you about that? And do you think that's a good idea?
We had lots of conversations about that.
Yeah.
And he has this idea that journalists should be able to accredit journalists. So, you know, you get a little badge like in the old days. It says, I'm a journalist, you know, treat me nicely.
Press.
Press hat. Which is, it's an interesting idea. It's problematic, I think, and he would say the same thing, but because of the way information is created and disseminated now. So everybody in the audience can be a journalist. I mean, everybody can find information, check the information, convey the information. And so it's very difficult to come up with a system of accreditation when it's so, there are so many people that it might apply to. That's one of many problems. But yeah, look, it's an interesting idea, and I think maybe it is something that, as the federal government is now consulting widely with the media and adjacent industries to on what it calls Newsmap, which is what it hopes to be a program that will map out the way government helps public interest journalism. And, maybe as part of that, which there will be a case to be made for journalists to be accredited, maybe by somebody. But again, who's going to be the accrediting body? I wouldn't be comfortable if it was the government. I don't know about you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wouldn't be comfortable.
It would need to be arm's length in some way. It would have to be, yeah.
Yeah.
And
so who's it going to be? Is it going to be the Australian Communications and Media Authority? That's government. Is it going to be the union? That's the union. So who is going to do the accrediting? I mean, I think there are all these kinds of problems.
Yeah. I just want to go back to something you said before, Emma, about what's happening in the US, and you were talking about the fundamental circumstances of people's lives and the way that they're driving sort of Trumpism and some of the sense of their engagement or sense of disenfranchisement with democracy. Just thinking about democracy in Australia and the health of our democracy, one of the things we know is that membership of political parties has been declining for many years. The primary votes for the major political parties have been in decline for a long time and are now historically low. Do you think there is a problem with the participatory health of our democracy? So, yes, we've got compulsory voting, yes, we've got the AEC, but do you think enough citizens are able to actively engage in our democratic processes? And I'll throw that open to everybody on the panel to have a go at that question, because I think it's sort of an important one about, one of the things that we know, for example, is that young people now are increasingly not reading news, or they're reading less news than they used to. They're getting information off social media. Do we have the right circumstances for people to be part of a meaningful democratic conversation?
I think it's such a good question, and I probably have a positive answer and a not so positive one. I think it's so interesting how that the statistics about the declining vote and membership of major parties is almost universally presented as a bad thing, because I think I'm actually of the view that the suite of independents that were elected to the parliament in the last election and the grassroots movements that brought them into the parliament are incredibly positive things, and such a wonderful example of that kind of participatory democracy that you're talking about, you know, that's kind of has its immediate origins in Cathy McGowan's election in Indi, which was just people in an electorate like sitting around a kitchen table and deciding they wanted something a bit better. That's the romantic version of the story, but I think it's fairly accurate. And that's being replicated across electorates, I think, is super exciting. And it's exciting as well because minority governments, you know, we have this understanding of minority governments as like chaotic and useless and they can't do anything. Actually, minority governments can be super effective. Like the Gillard minority government was actually really effective and passed heaps of legislation. And you can see independents in Parliament doing that now, you know, being really effective around things like HEX reform, for example, and pushing issues that affect voters in that way. So that's my positive answer. My negative one is that I think there are a number of particular issue areas where Australians aren't able to participate in policy debates or have a kind of any really level of participation in Australian policy and Australian politics. And that particularly for me stands out in an area that I look at a lot, which is Australian foreign policy, which is so far removed from any kind of democratic accountability that it's genuinely appalling. And I think the AUKUS submarine deal is kind of the epitome of that, really. You know, a decision that was, an agreement that was negotiated in secret, you know, with the knowledge of like under 20 people for 18 months, and a decision that was sprung on the Australian people overnight, which will completely reshapes our foreign policy, our role in the region. It turns us into a nuclear country, you know, against a long and proud history of anti-nuclear activism in Australia. And I think that the fact that there was not even any public discussion about that, and the fact that the public discussion now is still continually limited to, you know, a number of apparent experts in the area is a stain on our democracy.
Priya? Priya, do you have thoughts on?
Yeah, look, with my students, what I've seen is over the years, they feel extremely disempowered, but it's changing. And we have a Palestine encampment on campus now, which I didn't think I'd see, frankly, because our students tend to be a little conservative, but they're becoming a lot more politicised around those sorts of foreign policy issues, or protests against AUKUS, against the military-industrial complex, which is entering into universities as well. We have a weapons manufacturer on campus. So they're becoming increasingly politicised, but they don't necessarily have a way to enter into political parties and engage with political parties in the way that they want to. So that mechanism between political parties and regular people is broken, and it's a product of, you know, the cartelisation of political parties is what we call it in political science. You know, politicians tend to be lawyers now these days. They don't come from the union movement. They don't come from the shop floor anymore, in general. And that's a problem for Australian democracy. That's a real problem. And I'm not sure what the future is, where my students are going to go with their activism after they leave, whether it's going to die or whether it's going to be mobilised in some sort of other alternative political arena. I don't know. But I don't think the future is the Labor and Liberal parties anymore.
What do you think, Monica?
I think I'd agree with both Priya and Emma on this. I mean, and I also think there's another dimension for me that is, which is kind of a bit media related, but that is the disenfranchisement of people who live in rural and regional Australia. In part because of the breakdown in the media sector in regional Australia, and partly because of the way the information ecosystem is kind of fractured even in metro areas, you know, people, if you live in regional Australia, do you have much of a say in what happened? Do you get a voice in the debates that are occurring? which tend to occur in metro areas, on the front pages of the newspapers or on the, the airwaves, but they tend to occur in the major cities. They don't occur in Dubbo or Ballarat or wherever. It concerns me that there are millions and millions of people who've become essentially disenfranchised from the major public debates that are occurring. And we did some research around this at the Centre for a project that I'm leading on regional media, and we looked at the way narratives about really big, important issues for regional Australia, how they transfer to metro media. So we looked at the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and particularly as it relates to South Australia, and we looked at the issue of alcohol bans in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory. And what we found was that the really interesting, important debates were happening at local levels, particularly here in South Australia, which never appeared in any of the metro papers. They didn't break out of South Australia or even of the regional areas in South Australia. So, I think there's a real disconnect there and I don't know how you fix that. Unless we can move to a situation where metro media is more connected to what remains of regional media. That could be one solution. That's one possible blueprint. But I don't know. I do worry that is a real problem for our democracy. Is that we don't have we can't find a way to engage people who don't live in Sydney, Melbourne, or Canberra in the big debates.
Yeah, I think one of the things is there's a business media model thing behind that. So, you think about, say, for example, here in Adelaide, you've got the Adelaide Advertiser, and because of the way digital publishing works now, you're incentivised to do content that will chase clicks in a certain way, that will build your audience for commercial reasons. So media performing that democratic function, say, for example, of surfacing some of those debates, if there's a judgment call that it's not going to drive traffic in a way that doing other things will do, it's very, very hard for reporters and editors to push those stories to the point where they get the coverage. It's sort of another little thing that lies underneath it. Now, we're just getting to the point where we need to wrap up. So what I'm going to do, because I'm very interested in balance, is I want each member of the panel to give me one thing that you're pessimistic about in terms of democracy, something you're worried about or something you see as an issue that we need to continue to watch and think about, and one thing that's optimistic about that we can leave on a good note. So maybe, Emma, I'll start with you, because I know you're a little worried about what's happening with Julian Assange at the moment, and that might be something...
Yeah, sure. I'm not quite sure whether to put that in the optimistic or the pessimistic category, but that is something that I think is deeply related to what we've been speaking about and the role of media in democracy, because we have this extraordinary situation where we have two allies, the United States and Australia, that constantly tell us that our relationship is built on shared democratic values, and yet one of the members of that partnership is pursuing an Australian citizen for publishing the truth and has been asked by the Australian government on multiple occasions to let him go free and let him come home, and they won't do it. They haven't done it yet. But I am really hopeful that there are positive signs coming out of the Biden administration around whether they will consider dropping the prosecution of Julian Assange, and I'm really hopeful that the Parliament in Australia particularly is uniting behind that move and passing resolutions and writing letters to Congress. So it's something to be, I think, hopeful about and to keep fighting for, and particularly I think when we're talking about what we need to fight for in our democracies, it's that accountability and that truth-telling that Julian did and is being punished for, and to ensure, I think, that journalists everywhere are able to freely publish truth like that. So yeah, positive and negative,
both in the one answer. Monica?
Yeah,
Yes,
on you for bringing that up about Julian Assange. What am I positive about? I don't know. I'm generally positive that in Australia we are, a nation of well-meaning people overall, and that we want the best for each other, and that we will find a way to nut through a problem, and it's with very few exceptions generally okay in the end. What am I negative about? I'm really negative, it's a media issue, but I'm very, very negative about the possibility of media being able to break out of this habit it's gotten itself into of thinking that its role is to be an activist for something. You know, I mean, I want a media that is genuinely impartial. I want a fair player, and it seems to me that we've got these, you know, a media that's become really radicalised. You've either got uber right-wing media or uber left-wing media, and you've got a couple that try to wade down the middle, but they're pretty ineffectual. And so I really want a media that's impartial.
So Priya, what do you have?
I'm positive about the new forms of political mobilisation that are starting to emerge among young people, but also around independence, progressive political mobilisation. I'm pessimistic about the establishment's ability to engage and deal with that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I just want to add one for myself, which is I'm very optimistic about the fact that so many people could come out on a night like tonight to hear this conversation. It's terrific to be able to talk to you all. I'd like to thank the Hawke Centre for hosting us. We love coming to Adelaide. I'm optimistic about being invited back. So thank you so much.